from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the 6th week and the final week of our series entitled Our Dissolving Privacy, Who's Minding Your Business? I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I am sure you will enjoy the final program today. We have a very distinguished guest today, Mary Dent Crisp. She is the chair and national spokesperson for the National Republican Coalition for Choice. It was formed in the wake of the Supreme Court's Webster decision. Ms. Crisp, advisory board includes current and former United States congresspersons, United States senators, governors, and other state and local officials, as well as former First Lady Betty Ford and former Republican presidential nominee Barry Goldwater. Ms. Crisp was elected Republican National Committee woman from the state of Arizona in 1972 and was reelected to that post in 1976. Calling the roll of the states, Ms. Crisp was secretary to the 1976 Republican National Convention. Her 20 years of service to the party were highlighted by her election in 1977 as the co-chair of the Republican National Committee. She served the party in that capacity for 3.5 years. From 1984 to mid-1990, Ms. Crisp served as a senior advisor and national political director to business executives for National Security Incorporated. Our guest has formal education, holding degrees, one, a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and a master's program in political science from Arizona State University. Ms. Crisp, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our program.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
And as always, I'm very pleased to welcome our regular panel. First to my left is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
You have been a part of the symposium series here at North Idaho College, and you have talked with the students. Can you share with our viewers what your position was and what you advocated to the students today?
Well, of course I'm very pro-choice, and I started out by looking at Roe versus Wade, the landmark decision legalizing abortion, and that decision was based on the right of privacy. And of course that gave women their constitutional right to choose on this issue, and from that position on, politically, I tried to convey how dangerous it is for my Republican Party and the nation not to abide by the wishes of mainstream America. Over 80% of Americans believe that whether they favor or oppose abortion, they believe that the government has no business intruding in this very private decision.
Can you share with us some of the ways, if government is allowed to intrude into our lives, how this might be a creeping kind of thing that would eventually evade other privacies?
Well, I just take women, for example. If they were denied this right to choose abortion, they wouldn't have the opportunity to make those very private decisions that affect their lives most severely. And that is the number of children they're going to have, the size of their family, their education, their employment, their finances, their psychological and physiological well-being, and their very life aspirations and dreams. And I think you can apply that to almost other aspects of life in terms of what is happening today with the technology, with Social Security, where, as was discussed earlier, there are so many areas now where we are finding the American citizens just sort of acquiescing to this invasion of privacy without even really understanding what's happening.
Steve Schenck.
Mary, our guest last week took the position that Roe v. Wade was decided on the basis of privacy, but if the issue comes back before the Supreme Court, it will be the question of whether or not an unborn fetus is a living being or not that will be the pivotal decision the court will consider. Do you agree with that?
Well, I feel, number one, it'll be a long day before there is a case that comes before the court that will actually give the court the opportunity to overturn Roe. I think the Casey decision last spring or June, whenever it was, the Pennsylvania decision, certainly reaffirmed a woman's constitutional right to choose, but certainly offered more restrictive positions on the issue for women. So it's hard to tell just what actually will happen, and I believe that if you have this many people in the country, women believing that they should continue to have freedom to control their own bodies, there is no way the court is going to turn this around and base it on what your guest said last week.
I have heard figures about the general public's position on abortion that are close to yours, not quite as high as 80%. But our guest last week seemed to feel that it was all a function of how the question is posed. Do you feel comfortable that when fairly presented, do you favor abortion or don't you, that the majority of the American people would say, I favor choice as opposed to...
Yes, I really do. And I think, in all fairness, if you look at the Roe decision, it was a very balanced decision in my view. It's like the Freedom of Choice Act now, which would codify the principles of Roe into national law. And what the Freedom of Choice Act is saying is that a state cannot restrict a woman's fundamental right to choose before fetal viability. And after that, it can restrict a woman's right to choose an abortion based on saving the life of the mother. So it's a very fair, balanced thing. And when you hear the arguments that it's abortion on demand and that women go up through their 9 months of their pregnancy and ask for abortion, that is just not true. And then so it depends what kinds of so-called facts you were using to determine your own arguments.
Mary, if I can call you that, please.
Yes, of course.
I would like to get a little bit more into the issue of privacy that Steve raised, because that has been the theme of this series on television and the symposium. In the case of Roe v. Wade, the U.S. Supreme Court looked into, among other places, the Ninth Amendment and found in their interpretation that privacy is there. And for our viewers who are not familiar with the Ninth Amendment, it indicates that all rights not explicitly stated in the first 8 amendments are reserved in the Ninth Amendment. The Founding Fathers not sure what might come up in the future. So with that decision, then do you take the position of the pro-choice movement that privacy is clearly placed through this interpretation in the Constitution and is the strongest argument for the position that a woman has a right to choose?
Well, I'm not that knowledgeable about the amendments and so forth, but I feel very strongly that this is a woman's issue. And when I hear the opposition talking about potential life, in my view, as a few cells getting together as a baby, and pitting this baby against a woman's decision, a private decision to control her own body and her own reproductive capacity, I mean, it's very difficult for me. I feel that we're talking about a human being when we talk about women, whose life experience has been probably for many, many years. And I think this woman certainly does deserve, and I think the court understood this when they came down with legalizing abortion with the Roe decision, that it was a woman's right to privacy to actually be able to control her own body.
And in relation to this whole question, I heard you say earlier today, and I want to give you a chance to elaborate on this on the program, that in challenging the men in the audience, that you indicated that men have had choices over their body in a way that women have not. Is that another underlying fundamental question in this whole debate?
Well, it seems to me that there are so many men in control of the anti-choice movement or pro-life movement. And as I said earlier today, that if men could become pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament, and it's not original with me. But it's true. It's very easy for men to talk about abortion and very glibly without understanding what women really experience. It is not an easy decision. It's a psychological and it's a traumatic decision for women. We don't make those decisions lightly. If you talk to any woman who does this, so when they talk about abortion on demand or abortion based on birth control as a method of birth control, it is a very shallow outlook upon women. And I think, as I said earlier, it's time that this nation trusts women to make their own decisions about their own bodies.
Janelle Burke.
One of the things that has happened more recently is that there have been limitations placed on abortion rights through various state legislatures, and those decisions have gone then to, well, the statutes have been challenged, and those statutes then have gone into the courts for an interpretation, and also as to whether or not they are constitutional. Can you talk a little bit about some of those cases and what it means, and the change perhaps from having a national standard to various state standards? Whether that's a wise or unwise thing.
Well, I'm not sure, but I think the Casey decision and, of course, the Russ decision, which now the gag rule has been overturned, but we're looking at restrictions to access. We're talking parental consent, 24-hour waiting period, informed consent. And when the court granted those as constitutional with the Casey decision, they really changed the standard of interpretation from strict scrutiny to undue burden. And I don't think it's been proven at this point whether a 24-hour waiting period is really an undue burden for women. And I think we are seeing in Mississippi, which is the only state at this point that has enforced this law, 24-hour waiting period, the harassment, the punitive measure that it is. I mean, women having to go to the clinic, then have to listen to the lecture about how bad it is and so forth, and then they're told they have to wait 24 hours, so then they have to go to a hotel. By that time, the opposition has gone into action, and they know that from the license plates what happens. Then they take that information and they harass the woman, her family, and they do the same thing with children. They're doing the same thing with doctors, which is part of some state statutes. Doctors who do abortions have to file reports, and those reports are accessible for a very small fee. And consequently, then the doctor, not only is he harassed, but then the privacy of the patient is also violated. So these are issues that we're going to have to be dealing with. And right now, it looks like the state legislatures are going to be the battleground for the struggle for women's lives.
So it looks like there's a real focus change to the state legislatures as an arena that's important in terms of the privacy issue and control of the body. What about the impact that this has on poor women as opposed to those who can afford to go somewhere, perhaps other places where they are less well known, obtain the services where it will not violate their privacy to the extent it would if you suddenly saw yourself on TV or were harassed by someone in your local
poor women
community?
and rural women particularly, and young women, are the ones who suffer the most. And thanks to the Clinton administration just the other day, the administration will appeal to the Congress to repeal the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits federal funding to Medicaid patients. And this will actually ensure that a poor woman will have the same access to choice that a rich woman has.
Steve Sheen.
Mary, one of the things that troubles me most about this issue is my perception anyway, that both sides care passionately and believe deeply. Are you seeing any movement at all? Is anyone changing anybody's mind? And what do you see happening in the future that could ever bring this issue to rest?
Well, I think what we've seen is a real change in the political environment. Since 1988, when the Webster decision came down, we've seen a real increase in pro-choice members of Congress, members of the Senate, and the pro-choice majority in this country has actually been galvanized and far better organized than before. Before 1988, before the Webster decision, everybody believed that Roe versus Wade would in fact protect a woman's constitutional right to choose. That has changed. The whole political environment has changed. And I think what we're going to see is more and more, it's just like the the 6 women now in the United States Senate, the 4 new women were all pro-choice. The 24 new women to the House of Representatives, they were all pro-choice. And so I think we're seeing a real change. And in the political arena, using the electoral process, we're going to see a real shift in what is, a woman's right to, her right to choose will be guaranteed eventually. And I think that the other point is that we should be dwelling more on prevention. This should be a common ground between the opposition and ourselves. We should be saying, how can we best prevent abortions? That's what they don't want. They want abortions to be eliminated. Well, let's get on with it and figure out, because if you can prevent abortion, then you can prevent unintended pregnancies. And if you have better contraceptives and sex education. And unfortunately, there are too few of the anti-choicers who really want to join in this common denominator and figure out a way that we can, in fact, have some resolution to the problem in prevention.
Now, there's one other thing in this issue that I find particularly troubling, and I may need Tony's help to articulate it, but I was watching C-SPAN the other night, and someone, a pro-life advocate, was being interviewed by a federal committee, legislative committee, and was demanding, in a sense, his right through the First Amendment, to express his opinion, even through some of the tactics you described earlier, specifically following doctors, embarrassing them, harassing them. Where do we draw the line here? I firmly believe in everyone's right to state an opinion, but I'm equally firmly opposed to tactics that I see as crossing the line and actually infringing on the rights of other people.
Well, the Bray decision, I guess, that came down early January, actually prohibited the federal government from protecting women having access to clinics that provide health services. And now there has been maybe this was a hearing you saw, there's been a bill introduced into the House, which is called, I think, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act of 1993, which in fact would make it a federal crime to blockade clinics. So I think we're seeing two things. Yes, First Amendment says you can protest, you have freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but on the other hand, that is in conflict. You cannot blockade a clinic and disallow a woman her own constitutional right to have access to health care. So there are two different things there.
Tony, what justice?
The expert.
What Supreme Court justice said? This is a quote I'm going to ask you to identify. Your right to swing your fist ends at my nose. Was that Brandeis, or was it? It's the same sort of an issue.
Same sort of issue. And the other thing is too that prior to the decision that Mary was referring to, the court, in a series of cases over time, has, I think, done a rather outstanding job prior to that time of distinguishing between one's freedom to speak and certain actions that may infringe upon other people's issues. So there's case law that involves a lot of those questions on other matters, not just dealing with in this particular issue. Mary, if I may go on to deal with something that I used in introducing you. You're a very prominent Republican, and you have stood before the American people at the Republican Convention and called the roll, and I know you must have been close to President Ford since you were the co-chair of the party. Would you take a little time to tell us about a number of the key Republicans around the country that have joined your organization, and what are the plans of your organization and those Republicans in addressing this issue within the framework of the political agenda nationally?
Well, I think the anecdote I would use as an illustration for those people on our National Advisory Board is Barry Goldwater, Senator Goldwater. And this summer, at the time of the convention, he called me up. Of course, I obviously knew him from over the years, and we haven't always been on the same side of issues over time. But he called up and wanted to know, he wanted to get to Bush, and he wanted to complain about the Republican Party's platform. And he went on and on. I said, well, now, Barry, what is it you want me to do about this? I said, can I tell the press? He said, what the hell do you think I'm telling you this for? I mean, it was just, it was vintage Goldwater. And so he did send a wonderful letter saying the Republican Party would come down in shambles if, in fact, they continued to have this anti-choice position. But the other interesting thing about the senator is that Arizona had one of the most draconian ballot measures this past November, and I went out to Arizona, and the senator got very involved in this campaign, and this is Mr. Conservative. Of course, as the senator said, Barry said, the abortion issue is a very conservative issue because government has no business in helping to decide this issue. And so I think for us, in the pro-choice Republicans, to be able to say Barry Goldwater is one of us is very, very important. Obviously, Betty Ford is too. They all are. And I think that because our agenda is one where our paramount commitment is to preserving a woman's constitutional right to choose and building a Republican Party that would reflect that position, and in more specific goals is to elect pro-choice Republicans at all levels of government. And that includes that we will work to defeat anti-choice Republican in primaries, because we feel that's the best way to change the party's position. And of course, we want to change the position of the party on this issue. I think if we could take the bad language out of the platform completely, we would have made a giant stride. And I believe that we do provide a home and a national representation and a voice for the 71% pro-choice Republican majority. I mean, people feel it's sort of like an oxymoron that there are pro-choice Republicans, but in fact, that is true. And what we're trying to do is move the party to represent the majority of us rather than take a minority position.
Janelle Burke.
There are some basic inconsistencies at times between the position that the government should be able to legislate with regard to abortion and, in other words, telling people what they can do with respect to their own bodies. And the fact that they can, in a way, make a forced pregnancy. On the other hand, saying, we don't allow you to have an abortion. What are those inconsistencies, and can you explain them to our viewing audience?
Well, I'm not sure. The way I view it is that when you take the position, the pro-choice position, what you're really saying is that a woman has the right to carry her pregnancy to term. You're not denying her right, but when the anti-choice people say it, they would deny women their right to abortion. And so I think that in itself is inconsistent because, as I've said, I think they are legislating morality and their own morality, which really is denying somebody else their right.
I also want to ask you a question with regard to historical perspective. This is an issue that is not a new issue. It's as old as time, probably. Can you give our viewers some perspective of the historical evolution of this question?
Well, I'm not sure I can. I guess in this country it goes back to the middle or late part of the last century, and abortions used to be very available to everyone until I guess the midwives got into the act, and they were beginning to do deliveries and whatever, or abortions, and the medical community was getting organized, and they were losing out. They were losing business. And so consequently, in the very late part of the last century, the medical community decided that they needed to do something about it. So this is when some of these laws prohibiting abortions took place. And of course, the medical community was not that proficient either, I guess, in the issue itself. But politically, it wasn't an issue at all for a long, long time, until Roe came down. Before that, states were having their own problems trying to determine whether, in fact, women should have that right. And then with the Roe decision in 1973, it threw the whole issue back into the political arena. And we've had one decision after the other, which we've just talked about.
In some states, as a matter of fact, you could go from one state border to another, and the availability of services would be different. Isn't that correct, before Roe versus Wade?
Oh, that's right. And I think that's what we possibly will see again, unless we can really standardize the laws and pass the Freedom of Choice Act. It's just like in North Dakota, there is one health care center that provides abortions, and that's in Bismarck. And women travel hundreds and hundreds of miles to get there. And it makes it very, very difficult. In fact, I understand, I guess the Supreme Court had been asked to make a decision to Justice Blackmun on this issue in North Dakota, the Women's Center there, and had made a plea on a crisis basis to the court. And they're going to have an emergency meeting today. In other words, Justice Blackmun said they could not enforce the law. It's a 24-hour waiting period law, like the one in Mississippi. So it'll be interesting to see the outcome. It'll be critical, because will it be based on undue burden? Will they really believe that this is something that's very difficult for women, a real obstacle to her achieving her right to choose?
I should interject, it's April the 2nd when we're taping this program. By the time it runs, that decision will have been behind us for a few weeks.
Oh, that's right.
Steve Shink.
Mary, 71% of Republicans favor choice. I would assume a slightly higher percentage of Democrats do if 80% of the overall population favors it. If this isn't then a political issue, though it has obvious political consequences, what kind of an issue is it? Is it a moral issue?
It's a political issue. I mean, it's in the political arena, and like everyone says, they wish it wasn't. They wish it wasn't a political issue. Let's take it out of politics. Well, the fact of the matter is, it's in politics. And I think my Republican Party is partially responsible for that, for the kinds of people they appointed to the Supreme Court. It is a moral issue also, because then it's a religious issue for some people. And you could also probably argue on separation of church and state that this is when you get into the religious aspect of this, is that not a confusion in this country and a First Amendment kind of problem? I really don't know. But I think the imposition of one person's religious beliefs on another, if you're talking about religious freedom, we have another problem with it.
Mary, we have about 1 minute left. It always comes to this. Is your organization joining with other pro-choice organizations to look at different states and monitor where you want to work in relation to legislation that might be taking place?
Well, we work with National Abortion Rights Action League, Planned Parenthood, American University Women, and People for the American Way. All of the pro-choice community does work together at some leadership level, because we share each other's resources and have a much better idea of what states we can go into, where we can be most effective in protecting a woman's right to choose on the abortion issue.
On that note, I have to bring our program to conclusion on behalf of the panel and the staff. Thank you for being with us during this 30 minutes.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Ladies and gentlemen, with this program, we are concluding a 6-week series that we've dealt with called Our Dissolving Privacy, Who's Minding Your Business? Next week, we'll turn to a different topic, and we hope you'll join us then to look at a different issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.